Welcome to Swilhelm's Horror. We are a growing channel dedicated to bringing you the scariest stories that we are able to get our hands on. So if you enjoy that type of content and like hearing true stories that are guaranteed to send chills up your spine, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to our channel. And be sure to hit that notification bell as we plan on uploading 2 or more times per week. If there are 2 things to take away from this story, I hope that they're this. Never go diving in unexplored caves or sections of caves, and always make sure to check the weather before doing anything on or in the water. Just make sure to be prepared, because that was something that Jensen and Harry failed to do, and it placed them into a dire situation. The pair were avid divers and loved to go in the water, whether it be in the open sea or underwater cave systems. The two had both been diving for more than 10 years, and it was just something that they thought they would never get tired of. In 2013, Jensen and Harry had planned to spend 3 weeks in various towns and cities in New Zealand. The plan was simple: go diving, fishing, and just have an overall blast of a time. And that's exactly what they did. The pair went spearfishing, they went on a few boat rides, and they went on local hikes. It was one of the nicest trips that the two had ever been on, according to Jensen. That was until their last week of the trip. You see, that week was very similar to previous ones on their trip, and at one point, they were directed by someone who lived in the town that they were staying in to a nice hiking trail that would eventually lead them to an even better swimming hole that was a popular attraction to tourists. So Harry and Jensen took the man at his word and went to the trail that he had told them about. Right away, they could see why it was such a popular spot. The trail was full of life and amazing looking flora, and as soon as they came up on the swimming hole, they were in shock. The water was so clear they had never seen anything like it, and there was actually 3 people there already enjoying the day. And after seeing someone swimming around, the pair decided to check out the water for themselves and hopped right in. After cooling off for a bit, Harry ended up striking up a conversation with the other group of swimmers, and after talking a bit, he found out that the swimming hole was popular to divers too, as it sat right above a small set of cave systems. And after hearing how excited Harry got to hear this, the local made sure to let him know that most people didn't travel too deep into the cave though, because of how easy it was to get turned around in if you're unfamiliar with the systems there. Harry immediately relayed this news to Jensen, and the two decided that the following day they would return with their gear and head down into the caves just to check them out and truly enjoy their last few days in New Zealand. And that's exactly what they did. After waking up the next day, the two had breakfast, checked to make sure that they had all their gear and tanks that they would need, and headed out towards the watering hole. They each only brought 1 tank of air with them, because they figured they would only be in the water for about 2 hours tops, and even that would have been more than they expected. When they got to the swimming hole, they were surprised to see that no one was there that day, but they figured it was just too early, and it was a good thing because then they could go into the water undisturbed. So Jensen and Harry both set their gear up and got into the water and began swimming around near the surface. They were just double checking all of their gear and making sure that their equipment was up to par. And when both of them gave the thumbs up, they began descending into the caves. It didn't take long for the two to make their way into the first large open chamber in the cave, which is where most people tended to stop, because it was the area of the caves with the clearest view of the entrance. This was something that Jensen and Harry would have known had they spoken to anyone who had actually gone into the caves, but they hadn't. So to them, this was just the beginning, and after spending some time in the first chamber, they began to make their way further into the cave system. This was where things began to briefly narrow out as the two made their way through a smaller passage in the cave. The walls kept getting more and more narrow, and the water was beginning to become murky as their fins kicked up more and more silt off the walls. Thankfully, as the two pressed on, they managed to make it into the second wide-open cave in the system, and they were amazed. As the water became clear, the two were happy, though at this point it was significantly darker in the cave as there was almost zero light peeking in from the entrance. But the two had their headlights, so they weren't too concerned. But considering how tight of a squeeze they just passed through, Jensen figured they should stop in that chamber and not press on any further. So he signaled to his friend and the two just began exploring the large chamber that they were currently in. Now, if Harry and Jensen had been a little more patient before making their way into the water that morning, they might have checked the weather report. But because they hadn't, they had no idea that a rough storm was rolling into that area. And as the thick, dark gray clouds began to envelop the sky, the area grew darker and darker, and soon almost no light was leaking into the cave system whatsoever. This was something that the two didn't realize until they had been swimming around for about 45 minutes and Jensen's watch alarm began going off. He had set it so that he could keep track of time throughout their dive. It was at this point that he made his way over to Harry and figured maybe they should head back to the surface for a bit. So he made a couple of motions with his hands to signal to his friend that they should head back, and soon they were both turning in circles, looking for the exit to the chamber that they were. But now that no light was coming through, and they had been swimming around for almost an hour, they couldn't distinguish the exit from any of the other tunnels branching off from them. The two tried their best not to panic, and after looking around, Harry was fairly certain that he figured out which tunnel was the right one. The two divers began to make their way through the narrow shaft, but were quickly met with a dead end. The two did their best to carefully turn around and head back into the larger chamber and try again to find the proper exit. After a few more minutes of looking, Jensen was looking at one of the chambers that he had thought he might see light leaking through when he was grabbed by Harry. Harry showed Jensen his air gauge, and that it read that he was low on oxygen and they only had about 20 minutes left at this point. Harry panicked and began swimming into one of the many tunnels that led off of the chamber, and Jensen reluctantly followed. This shaft seemed a bit more promising than the last one, as it went on a little longer. However, it wasn't long before they hit another dead end, and at this point, Harry had begun to panic. His fins began to pick up more and more silt around them, so Jensen had to make a decision. He didn't waste any time, and he slowly and carefully began to push himself backwards out of the silt and into the big opening of the cave. Jensen shined his light into the silt, hoping to see his friend come swimming out. However, after waiting about 5 minutes, he knew he didn't have much more time. Jensen slowly began to swim away from the silt in the tunnel, constantly looking back over his shoulder as he did. He made his way over to the shaft that he had saw the light coming out of, and he knew he had one more shot to make it, and began swimming through the tunnel. It wasn't long before Jensen had entered back into that first big chamber, and he could now clearly see the exit. He turned back in hopes of seeing Harry slowly following behind him, but he saw nothing. He looked at his gauge. He only had 1 minute of air left, which meant that Harry only had a minute left too. Jensen knew then and there that his best friend was gone forever, and he was the only one making it out of the cave that day. Rescue divers went in to secure Harry's body 2 days after the storm cleared. When they found him, it was determined that when he began to panic, it was likely that he had knocked his head, which ended up knocking him out, along with the mouthpiece out of his mouth. It's likely that he drowned shortly after beginning to panic in the false exit. As for Jensen, even though he knows that there wasn't much he could have done to save Harry, he can't bring himself to get back into the water without him.